Welcome to the volunteer training for people interested in volunteering with foster care for Racine County. The purpose of this training essentially is for volunteers to have information and tools needed to provide confident, quality care for children waiting for placement at the Racine County Human Services Building. If you are somebody who is a foster parent, you do not need to take this training. This is a new training for us, so all feedback is valuable. Right now, though, I would like you to just take a moment and think of a favorite family tradition that you have. And we'll talk about that later in the training and also talk about why that's important. But think about just maybe one little thing that you and your family has done, whether that be if you guys enjoy celebrating Thanksgiving, who gets together, who creates what meals, something that is meaningful to you and valuable to you and your family. Also, this is a reminder for self-care. Some of the material that we'll be covering today can be difficult to talk about and to discuss. If you need to take a break, feel free to pause the video and take a break. My name and contact information, as well as someone from foster care, will be provided at the end of the video. And you will have an opportunity to contact us if you want to process or talk about any of this information as well. So today we're going to basically be going over this training in 3 different parts. We're going to be talking about the CPS process. We'll be talking about the basic understanding of trauma on development and behavior, and what your role as a volunteer is and who to connect with when you're a volunteer, so that you feel confident once you start volunteering and knowing where to go and ask questions. So for handout number 1, you guys should have 5 handouts. In handout number 1, I think it's really helpful for people to have information on all of the acronyms and abbreviations that can be used in foster care, CPS, which is Child Protective Services, because they're tossed around all the time. So I'm going to give you guys an example. And with handout 1, from this example, you guys will be able to look up what all of those terms are. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of how people can talk. And sometimes you can feel kind of left out, not knowing what all those abbreviations mean. And I think sometimes the case managers speak them without even realizing how many times a day they're using those acronyms. So for example, the department has a child who would like you to consider for placement in your home. On the surface, this looks a bit like a GIPS case, but really it's a CHIPS case. Johnny Jones is on a TPC at this time. There is some potential for a TPR, especially considering the ongoing CPS contact. The social worker has determined that he's an ICWA kid. You will be given the MA card and can expect a visit from the CASA. The GAL wants an AODA assessment for mom and would like us to coordinate with economic support for W2. Johnny is scheduled for an IEP and tested for LD, ID, and even EBD. From his behavior at school, it seems that he's ADD for sure, and possibly even ADHD. He doesn't need IL services yet, but we should start planning for that. And this was taken from the Foundation's curriculum from 2016. But I really like this handout. It's something you guys can use all the time. So I would take a minute and then go through the paragraph. And you can look up what the different terminology is. Some of these terms really are used all the time, like CHIPS. This is a child in need of protective services. TPR, which is the termination of parental rights. These are terms that you might hear quite a bit. AODA, which is alcohol and other related drug. W2, which is a lot of times what people talk about for different forms of economic support. LD, which is learning disability. So these are all different things. These are terms that you're probably going to hear pretty often. And it can be helpful for you guys to have this, especially if you're given maybe a write-up on something. You have no idea what it says, so definitely keep this form with you. And it's got probably, I think, like 12 pages of abbreviations and acronyms for you to go through. So this is a good handout to keep. And if you have questions on any of that, feel free to call me. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to kind of go over the CPS process a little bit, because I know a lot of times when people start getting involved with CPS, Child Protective Services, you're really kind of talking about a system. There are rules and statutes related to that system, and it can seem pretty daunting to kind of follow and understand how a child can come into care. There's also a lot of misconceptions out there on how a child is detained. So I just want to take a second just to give a real brief rundown on what the overview is of a child of the CPS process. Basically, so you have a better understanding and you have accurate information. So if a child comes into Child Protective Services, there's basically protocol that has to be followed. So if there's a phone call, let's say it comes in, that first phone call goes to basically the access center. It's where all the calls go. And the people that answer those phones are trained in how to talk to people who call in. They're also trained on statutes and sort of like what next steps are taken, considered depending upon what information is provided. So I want to let people know that, because I think it's important that this isn't something where it's a judgment call made by the person answering the phone. They actually have to follow rules for all calls and handle all calls the same way. So depending upon what information is provided, there's a screening decision that has to be made. Basically, that means is there not enough information possibly, so that call is screened out? Or is there enough information provided, and does it reach a level of safety where they need to screen that call in? So if the call is screened in, after that it goes to an initial assessment worker, and that person is basically assigned to check the safety situation either in the home or with the child. And there's protocol that they have to follow for that as well. After that initial assessment worker goes out, there's a safety decision that has to be made. So for example, if there's a situation that occurred in the home, is this something that safety issues can be made in the home so the child doesn't have to be detained? Is this something that reaches a level that the safety cannot be maintained in the home, and so therefore they need to look at other options? And if they have to detain a child, can that child go to another family member? They always look at other family members first. And if there isn't another family member available, that's often when foster care is contacted and a foster care placement needs to occur. So if a call is screened out, it's basically the case is closed, but they do keep records of that information. So sometimes if they continue to get calls, they can reevaluate if they need to send someone out. But oftentimes that just means there's not enough information provided to assess for safety. The next thing we're going to do, I think it's really important not just to talk about how children come into care, but also to sort of get their perspective. I think that's really important, primarily because I think sometimes what we perceive as saving a child isn't necessarily A, how they feel, and B, there's so many other questions and feelings that they have related to that experience of when they get detained. So we're going to watch a short video. It's called Removed. You should have the link provided for you. And it's about 12 or 14 minutes. So I would take a minute to watch that video from a child's perspective. Welcome back after watching the video. I know that can be a hard video for a lot of people to watch. I think it gives a really good description or kind of gives you a good example of how a lot of kids can feel when they come into care. And also some of the situations that can arise that none of us really like and we don't want to see happen, where when a child gets moved maybe several times, the impact it can have on children to be separated from their siblings, especially if you look at the situation of Chloe being separated from her little brother, who she was used to taking care of. And even some of the behavioral issues that Chloe had, and how she viewed that from her perspective versus maybe how someone in foster homes viewed her behavior. So I think those are all good things for you to be able to see and consider. It doesn't really encompass everyone's experience, but it does kind of give some good insight into oftentimes what it can be like for kids to be detained. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to contact me for that as well. The next we're going to kind of talk about a few facts about foster care currently in Racine County. So some of the general information for Racine County is that foster homes are supposed to be temporary placements for children 0 to 18 years old who cannot be safely or adequately cared for in their own home or a family member's home. Abuse, abandonment, and neglect are the most common reasons why children are placed in foster homes. The amount of time a child stays in a foster home can vary from as little as a few days to a number of years. In Racine, as of May 2017, there are approximately 350 Racine County children that were placed in out-of-home care, 225 children placed in foster homes in Racine County. Approximately 125 children were placed in care outside of Racine County. So I give you that information because it's really shows the need that we have for volunteers and the need that we have for foster homes. Primarily because if you think about or even refer back to the removed video with Chloe, think about how hard it would be for her to have a visit if she also lived out of the county, or for her to have a visit with her mother. It makes it really difficult for case managers to arrange visitation and also arrange to have children have sibling visits when they aren't, when it takes a couple hours for them to visit. But there's also, you have to look at the fact that the children not just lose their ability to possibly have visits, but they lose their school, they lose their community, they can lose their friends, they can lose the ability to see their pets, they can lose their sports, church, when they are out of county. So it's important to understand these facts and sort of what the big, why Racine County views it as so important to be able to get more foster homes and get more volunteers to help out in some capacity in foster care. So what this can mean by comparison, in 2016, Racine County children were placed at 127 licensed foster homes. 45 of these homes were outside of Racine County. Approximately 1 out of every 5 children could not be placed in their community. In 2016, there were 101 Racine County youth placed in treatment foster care. Approximately 40% were not able to get a best possible matching placement. And what I mean by that is that there could be times where, if it's an emergency and we have to place a child, we could know that we want to find a better match for the child, maybe a child that's closer to home because the parents want to visit, maybe someone that could also take their sibling, maybe a situation where that foster parent might go to a similar type of church as that child, and we might not be able to find that type of a match. In 2016, approximately 60% of the children placed in care were from sibling groups and had to be separated or placed out of Racine County to maintain their sibling connection, and were in a higher level of care than needed. So a lot of people have questions about that. So that would mean if a child has a high behavioral needs, they can be placed in a home that has a higher level of care. It's usually a foster home that has some training around taking some increased behaviors. So sometimes those children might have to go to a home with that is capable of taking care of a higher level of care. And there has been some situations where we might have to send a child to a group home and that child doesn't need a group home because there hasn't been a foster home available. So looking from where we were to where we're headed, so an average daily number of children in out-of-home care continues to significantly rise. So if you look at like the numbers from 2014, we had about 176 on average daily kids in care. As of June 2018, our daily average population is 294 children. I would like to point out, though, that that is actually a drop for the first time in several years since 2017, when we had an average of 312 children in care. So the number of approximate families served continues to increase. So 2014, we served 240 families. 2016, we served 304. So if you just consider the fact that we have more families that are in need of help and we have less homes, part of that reason is because we have children that will come into care and they'll go to a foster home. And then if another option for unification isn't available and that child needs a permanent home, oftentimes the foster parents that have been caring for them become that child's permanent home. Then we lose that foster home because they can't continue to foster because they have taken the children that they have previously taken placement of. So that's one positive reason that we have less homes. More of the negative concerns can be the fact that we do have a real opioid epidemic that's going on in Racine County, as it is basically across the country right now. So there's been a significant number of increase of children getting detained due to drug use, and it reaches a level of safety where we can't really put in a safety plan for those children to remain in care. So those are just a couple of the reasons that you see such a change in numbers. I will say probably within the last year, we've made some significant changes in efforts to sort of really put a push on getting people to help out in any capacity, which is why we're doing this volunteer training, and to get people involved in whatever way possible to help out and prevent basically less chaos for the kids. So I think the next big thing to talk about if you're somebody that's going to be interested in doing volunteer work is confidentiality. I gave you guys for handout number 2, it's the confidentiality handout. The Department of Public Instruction, a discussion on confidentiality, they basically state, the confidentiality of information regarding children and their families is critical to maintaining our professional relationship with families and ensuring the privacy of families served by both child welfare agencies and schools. All employees and volunteers of these agencies should guarantee that this personal information is protected. There's a handout that talks about what you can share and what you can't share. It also talks about times that you may have to report information, and this is really important for you to know. And we'll go over the reporting process a little bit as well. I think one of the big points I'd like to point out for confidentiality, especially within Racine County, is that Racine County, there's a lot of people that know other people within Racine County. So I've definitely had personal experiences where I can go to the drugstore and run into people I know. I could talk to a client and they'll say, hey, you know so-and-so, which I might not be able to confirm or deny. It could end up being another client, but those two people are related, or they'd heard about something through another family member. So there's absolutely times where you just need to be really careful about not sharing people's personal information. One, just because it's their information and it's not your story to tell. And two, because Racine is not that huge in the sense that a lot of people know one another, and we've definitely had times, I think, where people have shared information and it has backfired because they thought that they were talking privately, and it could be something. I think there was an incident one time where someone had talked to someone was talking to one of their loved ones and was not necessarily giving out specific information, but they were at a restaurant, somebody that was sitting at another table just happened to be related to that person and knew who they were talking about. So you are not allowed to discuss it. If you have questions or concerns about what you can and can't share, definitely talk to the foster care unit or talk to a case manager, or feel free to call me. But we're going to go over this confidentiality handout. I got this actually from the state of Wisconsin's foster parent handbook guide, just because it also kind of applies for volunteering too, and also incorporates foster care. So it basically talks about the reason to respect confidentiality is federal law, state law, and foster home licensing standards require that information about children and their families remains confidential. Respecting confidentiality also helps build relationships. Child will trust you, the family will trust you, Keeping the child and family's information confidential shows respect for the family and for their history. So foster parents must respect the confidentiality of children, volunteers as well, foster parents must respect the confidentiality of volunteers as well of children in foster care and their families. Confidential information about a child placed in a foster home or that child's family cannot be discussed with friends, neighbors, relatives, professionals. On social media, that's a big one. Please do not post things on Facebook or with others who are not specifically authorized to receive the information. Anyone receiving or sharing information must do so according to assigned consent to release information. I think specifically for you guys as volunteers, basically the people that you're going to be talking to are going to be case managers that you can talk to about information. I think you might be talking to other volunteers. You can talk to other trained volunteers. It's just understanding that it can't be gossip if you're sharing information because one of you guys is ending maybe a volunteer shift and someone else is coming on. Or if you're just sort of sharing concern, honestly. If you need to sort of process what's happened or you feel like you need to talk things out, we can absolutely hook you up with possibly a foster parent or another volunteer or case manager or someone from the foster care unit so you can talk about things that maybe you've seen or heard that you find concerning or that you have questions about. I think the only time that you might not have to worry about confidentiality so much is if you're in a situation where there could be an emergency and you're talking to the police. You can break confidentiality for that. I can't imagine what you guys would have to do with that with volunteer work, but if you have questions, pretty much anytime you guys are volunteering, you're going to have staff around you, so I'd always check with staff. What you should know, though, about reporting information is that if a child or a parent discloses to you that they're going to harm themselves, harm someone else, talk about abuse that occurred to them or abuse that occurred to someone else, you guys are in the position of being lucky in the sense that you have people that are going to be there that can help walk you through that process. If you do have to report it, you would be considered someone that would have to report if information is shared if you're a volunteer for Racine County. Oftentimes, especially if you're going to be working with children that have just been detained and maybe sitting with them while a case manager is getting things together and maybe you're giving them lunch or dinner or hanging out with them for a little bit. If the child is just talking and might be revealing things, a lot of that information can be information that the case managers already have because it's an incident that just occurred. But it's always good to give them that information just in case that isn't the case and more information is added. So that's handout number 2. So we'll talk a little bit more about the reporting process. You'll be required to report information the child shares with you that someone has caused them harm. Just to reiterate, it could cause them harm if they know others are being harmed or if they are harming, thinking of harming themselves. The advantage of volunteering is that you have a contact person with you. You're not an investigator. This I cannot stress enough. We don't want you, I wouldn't even do it myself if they were talking to me, questioning the children, as this can be hard for them, could potentially create conflict when they are being professionally interviewed. However, children talk and they could share with you, or you could notice something of concern. So a lot of times when children are talking, they're not looking for you to give them an answer. They've been going through this experience. Sometimes they're just talking things out. If you could be ears for them, and then following up, if we start questioning them too much, sometimes that can create a conflict from people that are professionally interviewing the children. So, so just remember that your role is more of a support, and don't worry about being an interviewer. So now we're going to go on to the next section, which talks about culture and perspective. There is handout number 3 when they kind of talk about what is culture. So this handout I really like because it's pretty simple, but it breaks it down into culture is basically a system of values, beliefs, attitudes, traditions, and standards of behavior that govern the organization of people into social groups and regulate both individual and group behavior. Culture is adaptive. It is created by groups of individuals and incorporated into group life to assure the survival and well-being of the group's members. Culture can include things like cognitive systems, such as your beliefs and attitudes and values, norms, like what's an appropriate behavior considered in your sort of community, what are punishments and appropriate and inappropriate behavior, definitions of roles for members of the culture, what are the appropriate and expected behaviors of certain people based on their gender, social position, or area of responsibility in the society. If you think about spiritual or religious systems, economic systems, political systems, language, the products of life including artistic and technological artifacts produced by the group. Cultural components are created by individuals and incorporated into group life to regulate social organization and to assure the survival and well-being of group members. Sometimes I think we think things are natural or instinctive when actually it's more something that we have been culturally taught and have learned sort of over a lifetime. So if you think about what we talked about a little bit earlier today when I was asking you about what your family tradition is. It's important, especially if you think about kids that are being detained. They might be going to a different living environment. They could be sharing information with you that seems very normal to them and can seem very strange to you. So if you look on page 2 of your handouts, it says understanding your own values and patterns of behavior. So if you are with someone else watching this video, I would encourage you guys to maybe take a couple of moments and go through some of these questions, maybe ask yourself some of these questions. If not, maybe go through some of these questions and jot down some of the things that kind of stand out to you and sort of what your responses are. But there's a list of 7 questions that basically say, who took care of you when your mother had to go out? What form of discipline or punishment did your family use most often? What were the family rules about meals? Did your family have different expectations or different expectations for different children in the family? For example, older children had different responsibilities than younger children. There could be different expectations between boys and girls. Who made what kinds of decisions in your family? Which were made by your mother and which were made by your father? Did you have both parents in the home? Were there joint decisions made? Who did your family turn to for help and support in times of need or trouble? How did you help yourself? Were you allowed to help yourself? A religious group, a community, professional help, was that available? Did adults other than your parents care for you for a period of time or have a strong influence on your development? There's more questions than that, but those are some of the key highlights from this page that I think are really important for you to answer and kind of know for yourself, because we will judge and base judgment on other people depending upon what our own answers are and how we compare that to our own set of values and beliefs. So if you think about a child that's coming into care, they already are in a position of feeling judged. They might be feeling a little protective of their parent. And we could automatically be making assumptions about that parent, depending upon what we know or why the child was detained. So it's important to be really self-aware and also to be aware of the fact that we have children that can honestly just have different cultural perspectives than we do. And that could be something from being in a community where Maybe you are someone that does not have a lot of religious values, but you could have a child that comes from a family from very strict religious values and rules. You need to be respectful of that. So take a moment, go over those questions, and think about maybe what some of your own cultural beliefs are. So when we think about coming back and kind of talking about the question I asked you guys earlier about family traditions. If you think about whatever your answer was for your important family tradition, so kind of imagine being detained from your home, and then giving that child an experience of what your family tradition is that could be completely different than their experience. And sort of how that could impact their response to you, and how that could impact your response back to them. For example, we have some volunteers who don't do foster care, but they have done things like take some of our kids for the holidays. And that particular home tried very much to give a child that they had this last Christmas a very special Christmas for that child. But that home also made had a real conscious awareness of the fact that they weren't sure what that child's family traditions were, and kind of asked them to make sure they somehow incorporated both, which is really important. But also not so that we don't make automatic comments where, if they have some, sort of silly, not that early is silly, but something maybe kind of fun or silly that they do on the holidays, that we don't make comments around that saying like, well, that's stupid, or I don't know who would do that, and when they say we do. You don't want to be stuck in a situation where then you're either backpedaling or things like that. So definitely being aware of who you are, and what your perspectives are, and being open to the fact that people have different cultural values and perspectives is going to be really, really important. So culture is more complex than either race or ethnicity. Culture is a system of values, we need to remember. Culture is also adaptive. And we've had children that have incorporated other cultures into their own, and we can move and live in different environments, and our culture can change some, or change a lot. So also think about, maybe take a few minutes and jot down a couple of reasons why you think that, or why you think that understanding what your culture is important in being a volunteer. And then maybe you can share that with your caseworker / foster care worker, and process that as you get trained and complete the paperwork to be a volunteer. So continuing talking about culture, we also need to look at perspective. I really like this slide because it shows a really easy example of how culture and our perspective are intertwined. So this slide basically just shows people doing international arrivals at an airport, and one guy is saying, he's trying to hold out his hand for a handshake, he's saying, what do I do now? And someone else is saying, when is he going to take my card? The woman is saying, he seems to be a bit unfriendly with his approach, because it looks like she's getting up in a gentleman's space, and he's basically saying, whoa, personal space invasion. And then the last guy on the far right is saying, I'm next, what should I do? So that's just greeting. That has nothing to do with any of our family traditions or values, the day-to-day living situations that we don't even consider to be part of our culture, just is. And just how complex greetings can be from our own perspective. So I like to give this example just because we think that just because it kind of shows the impact that culture has on our perspective and how we can view a simple exchange, even something as easy, typically, as a greeting. So if we go back to understanding our own values and patterns of behavior, if you guys could just take a few minutes and maybe go over some of those questions that we talked about earlier, and sort of evaluate or look at, consider, maybe understanding now how simple things can be perceived differently, even just from a simple greeting. Maybe it was those questions that we answered a little bit earlier about let's get an example here. Like, what were some of your family rules about meals? So even considering that question, whatever answer you came up with earlier, maybe taking a couple minutes to see how that could definitely, your perspective could be different when maybe feeding a child and what they're willing to eat, not willing to eat. One of the things I often talk to a lot of people that are working with kids about, maybe kids that come from situations where they don't have a lot of food available, they can sometimes not have very good manners. Manners might not have been a priority. They might come from a home where they didn't have a lot of access to good food. And so sometimes our perspective could be that child needs to learn how to eat vegetables, and I'm going to make them eat vegetables. Well, if you have a child that's just been detained, you also need to think about what message you're sending by saying, what do you mean you don't know what a carrot is? Or why aren't you eating carrots? And so sometimes you need to consider maybe what the situations were that they came from, and looking what your own perspective and culture is, and how that can influence how you're thinking about that child and that child's preferences, and also thinking about maybe where the child's come from, without judging. So the next slide talks about if we look at our perspective, a shift in perspective can bring a new reality, essentially. Helping those charged with caring for people struggling with trauma by simply changing the question from what is wrong with you to what happened to you and how can I support you can bring enormous understanding. This is a term that's become very popular. It's something that I hear often people talking about now. It doesn't make it any less important or less valuable. It is really good practice to be able to look at, especially if you're going to be doing volunteering with a wide variety of people, personalities, and cultures, to maybe not look at situations and saying, I can't believe they did that, what's wrong with them, and maybe start asking yourself the question, what led to that, and what happened to them. So one of the examples I want to give is just even, I can talk about a personal shift for myself. This can be something very, very simple. When I first started considering culture and perspective and my own values, I was thinking about how people show affection. So I come from a family that hugs and says, I love you a lot. I had been at a family party where I had friends of mine there. And my friend said to her parent, she said, oh, I forgot to tell you, Rebecca's family is very huggy. Which really gave me pause, because when I had met that family, they didn't hug me, but they kissed me on my face. And I remember thinking that was really personal. So their perspective was that because we hugged, we were very, I guess, hands-on, touchy. And my perspective was because they kissed me on my face when I first met them, that they were very touchy. So it was very interesting to me to learn that perspective, and to know that we just had two completely different sort of views on how to show affection within our family. But I also learned from that, even thinking about that when you greet family, when I would go and I'm asked to assess them sometimes in situations and family dynamics. So sometimes when I'm talking to different children and families, I'll kind of watch to see how they show affection, to see if there's some attachment there, and to see how bonded maybe they are. And what I've learned is that I can't look at that from my perspective, that affection can be shown in lots of different ways. So that's just one example, and that's affection. That's not talking about abuse, neglect, abandonment. It's not talking about religious beliefs or, what I believe in family dynamics, the structure of a family, or any of the issues I think that we often associate with culture. This was just how you show affection. So that's one example to kind of think about as well. I also want to share a story with you about, I want you to think about, well, I'll get to that. So let me share a story with you. So you have children that might be coming into care. Let's say you're the volunteer that's working for them. You find out that the mother has left the children unattended because she's an addict. The father also has left the children unattended because he believes that the mother should be raising the children. So he's trying to, and he thinks that she just needs to stop doing drugs. So the children are brought into care. They're hungry, they're dirty, and it's clear that that they have not been well taken care of. So take a minute to maybe write down your initial thoughts on what you think of the parents. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So, and I also want you to think about, how do you think your perspective of where a child has come from will influence your engagement with them? So the importance of understanding what our own views are in any interaction with children, really. So we talked a little bit about views of affection and how it affected my interpretation of others. So now that you've thought about the information that I provided to you about the family, the mother of the sibling set, so let me give you a little bit more information. So if you ask yourself what happened to this mother, what if I also told you, which is true by the way, this mother was neglected herself. The mother was encouraged to drink by her parents at a young age. And she had also been abused and neglected as an adult. Would that change any of your perspective on what you think of mom and her situation when she ended up neglecting the children? Oftentimes when I talk to groups of people about this, it's often changed their perspective once they have more information. It doesn't change the facts. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change that their abuse and neglect occurred. But looking at the difference between what's wrong with you, changing it to what happened, absolutely changes our perspective and maybe how we'll respond to the mom. And so then you kind of have to think about, would that change how you'd interact with the child? And a lot of times I think we want to say no, but the truth is that how we feel about things can come across. And that's when I use the example of divorced parents. Most of us know parents that have been split up or been divorced. We might not always know children that have been in and out of home care, but we can definitely relate to maybe friends, family, ourselves. If you think about a child of divorce, children are aware of an adult's response to their loved ones. So that's often why the courts, family members, the parents themselves often try not to say negative things about the other parent because it affects and hurts the children. If our beliefs come across and what we think about a child's parents. Even if we say that, oh, I would never say those things, usually our feelings about that parent can come across and it can impact the child. So it's important to really sort of have an open mind about what's happened to those parents for them to make those decisions. And I just want to point out too, because I'm giving all this information, I'm not saying that understanding and awareness doesn't mean that I'm excusing the behavior. It's really about connecting and understanding where that behaviors come from so that we can respond in a way that is helpful versus harmful. So we're going to go into the next section now, which is talking a little bit about trauma and development. And I think I really like this. It's a short clip. It's on how the brain was built, and you guys will have a link to that you should be able to click on. It's about 4 to 6 minutes, but it really talks about, it's a simple little kind of cartoon really, about how the brain is built, which is important in understanding development and the impact of trauma on development as we go into sort of this last section. So take a few minutes and watch that and then come back. So welcome back. If you guys have any questions about the short Brain Builders video, absolutely feel free to connect with me or someone from foster care. Now we're going to be talking a little bit about childhood development. I gave you guys a really great handout. I really like how this handout's broken down. This was from handout number 4. But basically it talks about the 5 domains of development for children. It talks about social development, emotional, physical, cognitive, and sexual. So if you take your handout, I'm not going to read all the pages to you. You can take a few minutes to read these. I don't know, there's probably 6 or 7 pages here. But I do want to point out sort of how it's structured, because I think it's important for you to know. It breaks it down into, first of all, the different domains. So for example, if you look at physical development, and then it will give you a definition of what physical development is, and then it will break it down into social development, but then it talks about some of the developmental milestones, and this is why I also really like this handout, because it breaks it down from infancy and toddler. So it talks about typical physical development between like birth to 3 years. And then it breaks it down into that for social, emotional, and sexual as well. And then once you get to preschool years, so it breaks it down by age group. So it's really nice because then you can sort of not just look at the different developmental stages, but you can look at it by age and also by category. And then from there, it actually gives you some real specific examples. So I think this is a really good handout to always have for you to go through. So I want you to take some time now to read through that. It shouldn't take you more than maybe, 15, 20 minutes to do. And then come back and we will go on to the next slide. And if you have, again, I know I keep saying it, but I can't stress it enough. If you have questions from this handout, or something doesn't ring true, you don't quite understand it, please feel free to connect with me. And again, the very last slide in this recording is going to have my contact information, so you can email me, and I will be happy to email you to answer any questions. But all the handouts I'm giving you today, I would absolutely hold on to these. These are ones that I use often. And I also really like this one because this one talks about typical developmental milestones. And then the last one, which we aren't going to get to yet, talks about the effects of maltreatment on development. So you sort of have it broken down into 2 different categories between what's typical and then what are some of the behaviors that you can see that affect development when a child's been maltreated. So with that, we're going to lead into the next section, which is what is trauma. So I took a couple of different examples of trauma. There's so many definitions out there of trauma right now. So I wanted to take one that sort of gives a broad view, and then we're going to kind of narrow it down a little bit. So psychological trauma is a type of trauma to the mind that occurs as a result of a severely distressing event. Trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. A traumatic event involves one's experience or repeating events of being overwhelmed that can be precipitated in weeks, years, or even decades as the person struggles to cope with the immediate circumstances, eventually leading to serious long-term negative consequences. And so that's sort of a term for psychological trauma, which is different than like a physical trauma. However, trauma differs between individuals according to their subjective experiences. This is very important for people to know. You can have two people that go through, or two children that go through the same thing, and how it affects one child can be very different than how it affects another child. One child might have experienced that traumatic event, but they might not be going through trauma because of it, where you can have another child that does, or adults for that matter. So people will react to similar events differently. In other words, not all people who experience a potentially traumatic event will actually become psychologically traumatized. However, it is possible to develop post-traumatic stress disorder after being exposed to a potentially traumatic event. This discrepancy in risk rate can be attributed to protective factors some individuals may have that enable them to cope with trauma. They are related to temperamental and environmental factors. Some examples are mild exposure to stress early in life, resiliency characteristics, and active seeking of help. So these are good definitions for you guys to have, and I like the way it's broken down a little bit as far as being able to sort of differentiate between, they're talking about psychological traumas, not physical traumas, and also breaking it down between really understanding that you can have somebody that's gone through an event and come out and not really have any long-term effects from it. You could have somebody else that might not be as resilient or might have had more repeated exposures to something and might not have had the support system needed and can have much more impact on their, that traumatic event can have much more long-term impact on them emotionally and developmentally, especially if they're a child. So we're going to be talking more a little bit about a term that is often used called complex trauma. It basically describes both children's exposure to multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature and the wide-ranging long-term impact of this exposure. So if you think of it in terms of domestic violence, you can have a child that's been repeatedly exposed to domestic violence and been living in an environment where they don't always necessarily know when violence is going to occur. They could feel like they're kind of walking on eggshells all the time, so that, you know, the person that is the perpetrator is essentially not getting upset. Sometimes they could be in situations where they could be worried about the safety of others in their home, and sometimes even for their own safety. So if you think about those repeated exposures over a long period of time, that's what they call as complex trauma versus something that is one event that maybe could have been like a bad car accident that was very emotionally impactful for somebody. So these events are severe and pervasive, such as abuse or profound neglect. They usually begin early in life and can disrupt many aspects of a child's development and the very formation of a self, since they often occur in the context of a child's relationship with a caregiver. They interfere with the child's ability to form a secure attachment bond. Many aspects of a child's healthy physical and mental development rely on this primary source of safety and stability. And also, I put the site down for where I got that. If you type in that acronym to online, that will actually take you to a trauma site that has some really good, valuable information if you want to look at, explore some more information. So why is it important for you to understand this as you're volunteering? I think most of that's pretty obvious if you're having a child that's been detained. Usually you can, not always, but usually the children that are detained have been exposed to complex trauma, have experienced it. Usually they come into care, not always, but usually due to more than one traumatic event. And it can interrupt their development in a lot of different ways. And it can give them a lot of insecurities that is important for you if you're going to be doing volunteer work to kind of have some basic knowledge about. So we're going to look a little bit about trauma and childhood development. Dr. Perry from the Child Trauma Academy, he has a clip here that I want you guys to watch. He's using it from, it's a domestic violence clip, but it kind of talks about complex trauma and the repeated exposure of a child that's been exposed to complex trauma. And then we're going to look at handout number 5, which is the impact of trauma on development. So if you want to take a few minutes and watch that video, I think that clip is about 14 minutes long. And then we'll talk about handout number 5. So welcome back, and we are looking at handout number 5, the effects of maltreatment on development. Similar to the other handout that I gave you from handout number 4 on that broke down the different stages of developmental milestones. This one specifically talks about the impact of maltreatment on development. So I think if you're someone that's going to be working with infants and toddlers, for example, let's say you're asked to come in to sit and hold a toddler for a little while or an infant for a little while maybe they're waiting for their foster parent to be able to come and get them, or maybe another family member is driving from out of state to come and get them. And so you come up to Human Services to spend some time with the child before their caregiver gets here. It's kind of good to know some of this information. So if you look at, children that might be some of the things that you could see from effects of maltreatment on development for infants and toddlers, I'm not going to go through every single one. I do want you to read this whole thing yourself, but one of the things that you could see might be, for children who've had a lot of chronic malnutrition, they could be very small. Some of them can have brain damage from that, but those are things that you would know about beforehand, because usually the children under those circumstances are usually at the hospital first. I actually don't know the time that they have in bed. But you could also look at blows or slaps to the side of the head over the ear can injure the inner ear and cause partial or complete hearing loss. Physical injuries, both internal and external, can lead to permanent physical disability or death. Medical neglect. We've had some children that have been detained, for example, if they've, not super common, but common enough, it would be a child that might have some type of disability or disease where they might need constant medicine on a regular basis, and say like insulin or something. And if a parent doesn't provide that on a regular basis, they could come in and be pretty sick from that. So they always get medical treatment first. But they could be, small for their age. They might need lots of medications. Sometimes we'll have kids that might have feeding tubes and things like that could be disconcerting. So I would be sure to read through this handout. And if you have questions, if you're told the child has had some physical maltreatment, to see, ask as many questions with the case manager or the foster care unit as you need to feel comfortable. Because I can promise you that they're not going to put you with a child that you're not going to be comfortable sitting with. And if they require a lot of care, they're going to be with trained staff for that. But look through these, because you could have children that for socially, infants may fail to form attachments to the primary caregivers. So you could have a child that might not respond typically like other infants or toddlers You might notice that they might not look at you at all, even though you're trying to engage them. You can have a child that might be overly clingy and start calling you mom or dad right away, even though you just met them. We've had some kids that they don't have a lot of really good personal space boundaries, and they don't have any real strong sense of safety. So they'll climb right up on your lap. And we'll have some kids that will be the complete opposite. Well, they'll be very wary of you no matter how hard you try. So it's good for you to have some of that awareness. So if you have a child that doesn't want to be held, then maybe you sit on the floor with them and read a book. If you have a child that wants to sit with you, maybe it's something that you can, put them on your lap and read a book to them. Some of the infants really like to be rocked, so you can do some rocking. So there's lots of opportunities to sort of meet the child where they're at, but also make sure that you feel comfortable and secure in how you're interacting with them. So this is really good because it breaks it down. It talks about toddlers might feel like they're bad children. I want to point that one out from this handout. We'll have a lot of kids that talk about the fact that they're bad. We have a lot of children that might be very watchful. We've had kids that are very quiet and they'll say that child is such an angel. They're perfect. They listen to everything that I've said. And so sometimes we can interpret that to be that the child is fine, when in reality the child is just being very watchful because the child is not trusting anything or anyone around them. So it's important for you to read through this. It breaks it down into a lot of different emotional, social, cognitive, physical impacts of trauma on development, and it will also break it down similar to the last handout when they break it down by age, all the way up to teens. So read through all of that. I'm not going to read every line to you guys. I want you to read it, talk about it, and if you want to talk to me about it, please feel free to call me. I would encourage you to talk about it with your volunteer foster care unit worker. This is a good handout also for you to keep and to refer back to. I don't expect anyone to be able to memorize all this information. This is why I want you guys to hold on to all of these handouts, from confidentiality all the way down to looking at the acronyms that we had laid out, and then the effects of development. So talking about going back to after you have watched your clip from Dr. Perry and then looked at the handout number 5, think about how this impacts your engagement with children for volunteer work. So we talked about that just a little bit, but like I said, if you have a child that, for example, could be crying a lot, could be very needy, how you engage them could be slightly different. Like I had noted with, if you have a child that doesn't want you to sit really close to them, maybe you don't, maybe they're sitting in one part of the room, maybe you sit in a different part of the room and read to them. Oftentimes, the children will still be participating. It just might not feel how you've typically done that with maybe children you've raised or other children in your family. Sometimes they can ask you questions that can be very personal because they've never been taught to not ask those questions. So I always feel like it's good to have a couple of pretty basic answers in your back pocket to keep things calm without pointing it out to a child that you don't ask those questions right now. That's too personal. Usually when you guys will be volunteering, letting people know that they're asking those questions can sometimes be helpful, but I wouldn't worry about trying to correct them or teach them a different way in that particular moment in time, because they are often in a situation where the focus is to make them feel supported and comfortable until they can get to their next placement or first placement, depending on what the situation might be. So one of the other things to think about, and we're going to use the example of greetings again, is if we think about when you begin to volunteer, You know, if you have a child that's just been detained, let's say they've had some of this repeated trauma exposure, they've had some complex trauma, they've gone through a lot of complex traumatic events, then you're coming in to sit with them or hang out with them, give them a meal, until decisions can be made for their permanency, for the time being. Think about how you would greet them. From their perspective, you know, do you think it would be a good idea to come in and be like, hey, I'm Rebecca, I'm so excited to meet you, what would you like to do today? They might kind of look at you weird because they're going through a really horrible situation. So maybe it's, you know, coming in with more of a calm tone, saying, you know, I'm Rebecca or I'm so-and-so, and, I'm here to be with you for a little while, make sure you get some food, are you hungry? I noticed sometimes with some kids too, which you'll be able to talk to your foster care unit volunteer worker about as well at length, is kind of looking for some initial things that you can do when engaging children. I think sometimes we're looking at situations where sometimes they don't ask kids things, they just offer, and they'll either take it or they won't. So if they, food for example, if I know I've been told that they haven't eaten and I've been asked to bring them a meal, I'll bring a meal and I will just offer them a meal without necessarily saying, would you like this or not like this? Because then it doesn't put them in a position of not wanting to or wanting to accept your, doesn't make them feel like they're breaking loyalty necessarily if they accept the food, if that's how they're feeling, or just saying no just because they're angry. So sometimes I just offer, put things out there, and then sitting with them and being sort of a presence for them can be much more supportive than you think it would be. So what are some of your fears or concerns in volunteering? I would write some of those things down. Make sure you talk to the respite or your foster care unit volunteer worker about those questions, or feel free to call me. This is a lot of information I've given you today and sort of thrown at you. We still have more to go. But I want you to be able to think about what some of your fears are so that we can or concerns are so that we can sort of talk that through so you feel confident and comfortable when you start volunteering. So for some of this last section, I kind of want to talk about what happens when children are detained, and sort of what your role is a little more. When we talk about kids that are detained, we did talk about this a little bit when we talk about children. When they come into care, coming into care or being detained from the home itself can be a pretty overwhelming, impressive moment. For some kids, it can be a traumatic event. So we talk about that in terms of what that can do to children during those times. And if these are kids that have been repeatedly exposed to traumatic events, or if the way the situation went down for the child to be detained was dramatic, it can be even more impactful. So we can have children that will sort of go into fight, flight, or freeze. I'm sure many of you have heard that term before, but it's basically what happens when we go into survival mode. Our lower brain kind of takes over and responds for us. We're not really thinking things through. So the way I like this slide, because it basically breaks it down very simply, when it talks about when you go into survival mode, think about a time where, I always like to use this example because it's happened to most people. Have you ever had somebody cut you off and you've been driving and you've automatically thrown your arm out to protect whoever's sitting next to you? There's been times I've saved my purse because there's no one even been sitting there, and I've thrown my arm out. It's some automatic response. I have no idea where it came from. So that's not something where I was thinking it through. I was just responding. And there are times where you will absolutely have moments in your life where you will just be responding. There was a time where again, this is related to a car accident, but I hadn't had a car accident. I could not tell you what happened initially after that car accident. I know what people said I did. I'd had somebody cut me off, and I basically went through the motions, but I was pretty checked out. And I didn't run, but I did kind of fight, since I had to kind of fight to get out of the car. And I made sure that the steps were taken. And I didn't freeze, but I also wasn't really present either. So I didn't really recall what had happened until later. So you could have children that come in that have just gone through this really crazy, terrible ordeal with their parents, where they're separated from their caregivers. And they might not remember a lot of their interactions with you or anyone initially. They also might not be in a position where they are feeling, they might not be very verbal in how much they're talking. And they're basically in survival mode. And so I like this slide because it breaks it down, talking about the logical, smart part of your brain basically goes offline, and that the lower part of the brain takes over so that we survive. So it's the real simple way to kind of put it and to remember it. So when we talk about children being detained, so if you have a child that's kind of going through this traumatic event, essentially, they also are feeling a lot of grief and loss. So when children are detained, they are often fearful and worried. When are they going to go into foster care? They are also experiencing grief. So if you think about, remember the video Removed that we watched earlier today, and what that can mean for loss. You know, like this image I really like, it's a child basically sitting there saying, I didn't get to say goodbye. So an example I'd like to share with you too is, I think sometimes we, again, considering our own personal perspectives, I think as adults we often think about things from an adult perspective, that, wow, you know, that this child must be really missing their mom or their dad. Or sometimes we also think, wow, this child's really lucky that they were able to come into my home so that I could give them a really good home. I'm going to make sure that they're taken care of. I'm going to give them a really nice bedroom. And that's not what the child is thinking about. The child could be thinking about, I'm going to give you an example. I had a child who was very dramatically abused. And she told at school, she told the teacher. And it was something that required immediate investigation. Family goes out, the police go out, the father in the home was immediately arrested because they found evidence of things. Child is then brought into care. The child is pretty hysterical because from the child's perspective, she had just told about something that had happened to her, and yet she gets detained and brought into care. So she gets brought into care. She can't stay with her mom because her mom is unsure who she believes. And because of that, she couldn't stay in the home because mom was not going to protect her against dad and other family members. So they asked me to go out and talk to her. So I go out and talk to her, and I said, you know, if there's one thing I could do for you today, what can I do to help make tonight a little bit better, considering, you know, all the hard things that have happened today. And so what do you think she said? So if you want to take a minute and just think about maybe something that she said. A lot of the adults thought that she was going to talk about being upset with her mom, talked about missing her mom, talked about her siblings, or the fact that she was taken away from home after telling. But actually what she said to me was that she missed her dogs. She was worried about her dogs because if her mom didn't believe her, she didn't want her mom punishing her dogs. So I made sure that I was able to contact the case manager that was able to make sure that her pets were okay, and then she was able to sleep that night. So when we talk about children getting detained, they aren't experiencing grief and loss just for things that are obvious to us. They are losing their whole world. They could be losing their bedroom. It might be the one safe place that they have. They could be losing the only things in their lives that they consider that love them, like their pets. They don't know what ever happens to them. So those are things to really consider and understand that we aren't going to always know all the answers or all the reasons why children are upset. And it's important to be able to be open and talking to them about some of those things, because what we learn from their perspective can be such a huge eye-opener. I've never forgot that when that happened to me, because I just thought, she'd been living with these terrible circumstances for a very long time. And so the only thing that had been really seeing her through was the love of her dogs. And so I learned she'd be completely upset about losing her dogs. So anyway, wanted to share that with you and have you guys think about those things as well when we talk about children getting detained. So we talk about activities and regulation, being a supportive presence. I think some of the hands-on things that will be provided for you but are important to use when you talk about kids who've gone through a lot of traumatic events and you aren't really necessarily sure what to do when you're spending time with them. So we'll have some tool bags that will have, hopefully utilizing some art supplies, crafts, coloring books, music, games, reading, stress balls, drinking, things that take time, like drinking with straws. That can also be very regulating to children. Weaving, knitting, having suckers and gum if appropriate, depending upon the age, giving a child a meal. These are all things that can be very useful and also keep children engaged. We keep them engaged in a way that sort of helps them stay regulated and calm, keep them maybe a little active and busy. And it's something that you can do with them without necessarily rehashing, everything that's happened from their day. So talking about engagement and support, if when children ask you questions you can't answer, how do you respond? You could have a child that, because you're spending time with them, can ask you questions like, when am I going to be able to see my mom? And so you can give a real basic answer. I would talk to your workers and the people that are supporting you or the case managers about, before you go in, any information that you can share or can't share. But you should also have, I always say in the back pocket, you should always have a couple of phrases that you sort of keep at the ready to answer children that is honest and sincere, but also a way to be able to respond to them if you can't answer some of those questions. So if they're asking you when you can see mom and you say, I don't know, you can say, I'm not really sure. I'm here to spend time with you. But when the case manager comes in, or maybe I'll step out and ask the case manager when I can, whatever the situation might be, you can always just sort of identify the people that they can answer those questions to, and just say, I'm sorry, I wish I could answer that for you, or I'm not sure, I'm just here, I don't know your mom. If you're worried, we can make sure we let the case manager know. Those are all some basic responses that you can give that will sort of show support and at the same time not make you feel sort of stuck not being able to respond to some of those questions. And allowing the kids to have their feelings, the importance of being with them in the present. We're going to have kids that could cry. I wouldn't try and make them laugh when you know that they've had a hard time. It could be something where if they're crying, just say, it's been a really sad, hard day. While we wait, do you want to do some coloring, or maybe sit and watch a movie with me? Allowing them to sort of have their feelings and sort of offering support so they don't feel so alone. Sort of what we talked about before when I talked about the greetings, it's sort of offering versus asking. Sometimes when you're in those moments, asking children questions, or adults too, quite honestly, can feel overwhelming and trying to figure that out. So sometimes just offering people things. If you can tell a child might need some distraction, just saying, I'm going to put in a movie or some music, which one would you like? And if they really say no, then you know the answer to that. But sometimes just sort of doing it can also be something that can be helpful to them. And we'll catch their attention for a little bit while they wait. So contacts for concerns when you arrive to volunteer. One of the advantages to being a volunteer, especially here at Human Services, you always have a case manager or an initial assessment worker that's going to be available to you, because that's going to be the children that are there are going to be their family that they work with. So you should always have somebody like that. You should always have an identified foster care unit staff person to ask questions to too. So you should, if you ever feel stuck, you should never not have a resource. That person might change depending upon when you're volunteering, but you should always at least have those two people around. Because part of the reason that we want to have the volunteers at Human Services, for one example, would be to allow the case manager to make needed arrangements, but the case manager might be on the phone arranging things, but they're there while you're there and can help you. And then there should always be a foster care unit worker there too, to support too when children are getting placed. So they should be able to have some answers for you as well. So the very last thing I'm going to talk to you guys about is self-care. It can be very emotional sometimes doing this work and volunteer work, especially when we're talking about things that have happened to children, especially knowing things that have happened to children's parents. Can be pretty overwhelming. So I really encourage people to think about self-care and think about maybe if you're somebody that needs to talk something through, maybe debriefing with either someone from foster care, me, if I'm available, or the case manager before you leave. If you're somebody that just needs to kind of process things and you want to talk about it later, feel free to call us, as well. I'm one of those people where I might not have anything right then, but I might have something I want to absorb it and maybe talk to somebody about it later. And then maybe think about things that you do for self-care. If you're somebody that likes to read, maybe make sure you have some books on hand after you volunteer. If you're somebody that likes to go out to dinner with friends, if you like to spend time with your kids, go to the park or whatever that might be, just make sure that you take some time to do those things. And we're going to do this last self-care video. I love this video. It's by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. She wrote a book called Trauma Stewardship. She has a great clip that's attached for you. It's from a TED Talks that she had done. It's about 15 to 20 minutes. I can't remember exactly, but it's a really good video basically talking about how it's unethical not to do good self-care. I will also tell you it's worth watching because she has many jokes in there, so it is very funny. It's entertaining to watch, and she really kind of pushes the point home why it's important to do self-care, especially in this type of work in any capacity, volunteering or otherwise. And so the last thing I'll leave with is with the importance of self-care is you cannot give what you do not have, which is something that a social worker, I think she's in Colorado, and she's also a treatment foster parent for many years, Julia Alvarado, said. So self-care is important because you can't give what you don't have. So if you don't have patience, you can't give it. If you aren't in a place to be flexible, you're not going to be able to offer it. And those are things that are vital to being able to do this work, to be a volunteer. So it's important to be able to practice self-care. And the last thing I want to tell you guys is thank you. Thank you for even considering being a volunteer. I feel like I have just thrown a huge amount of information at you. This is the first time I've done a video recording without an actual group of people here, so any feedback is helpful. If you would like to have more information on certain things, please let us know, because we are developing a lot of this training regarding as we expand different options for people to do volunteer work and things like that. So all feedback is useful. So the last thing on here is my email address, so please feel free to email me. And then I'm also going to give you Marie Hargrove, recruitment and retention specialist with foster care. And so you can do marie.hargrove@racinecounty.com, or you can call her at 262-638-6595, or feel free to give me a phone call. I'll give you my number too. Email is better, but my number is 262-638-6574. Thank you guys for spending the time to do this training today, and let us know if you need anything else. Thanks again.